how many people here would say you're a data-driven PM? Show of hands.
Ooh, that's a great question.
Okay, half the room-ish. Now, how many people would actually launch all of your features as experiments and measure the metric impact of everything that goes out the door? Show of hands. Hunlin, there we go. Okay, so definitely a delta between those two groups. So, as Vishal mentioned earlier, you can't optimize what you don't measure. And so what we're going to be talking a little bit about today is how we can make the case for experimentation as product leaders within our organizations. So by way of introduction, I lead the product team at a company called Statsig. And Statsig is an experimentation and feature flagging platform that powers companies like Notion, Figma, Atlassian, and even Microsoft to be more data-driven in how they build products. We're based out of Seattle, beautiful Pacific Northwest, but I was in the Bay Area for many, many years, and I'm thrilled to be back here this morning to talk about data-driven product development. But before we can go into culture building, I think it's important to, address the elephant in the room, which is why is experimentation important? Interestingly, when I did the poll, only probably a third of the hands in the room went up. So that means a lot of folks are launching products without experimenting and without being very data-driven. So for me, I tend to learn things the hard way, and one of my early experiences really hit home why it's important to experiment. So the year was 2016. I was working on our international markets at Uber, and the whole company had been working together on this big rider app redesign. So I don't know if folks used Uber back in the day, but you will have noticed in 2016 the app kind of turned itself on its head by going destination first. And so this was a big cross-company effort. There was probably 12 plus months of work involved, 10 big feature updates, all rolled into like this beautiful, sexy new app. We launched it, we were good, we measured it as an experiment, and we started tracking the metric impact across different regions. And something interesting happened. The app was very positive in most regions, so metrics were neutral to positive, but in India and Southeast Asia in particular, it was very bad for trips. So trips were down, revenue was down, everything was regressing. And I was responsible for those regions at the time, and I was trying to figure out, okay, what's going on here? So I started to unpack all those changes. But the problem was, as I mentioned, we kind of bundled 10 plus product changes into this redesign. And so pinpointing exactly which one was causing these metric regressions was pretty tough. So we started to undo them and try to figure out, okay, which one's the culprit? And it turned out the crux of the entire redesign was at fault. We had taken what was previously a flow where you entered your current location. So you would drop a pin and get a driver to come to you, and then you might tell the driver where you're going or enter it in the app optionally, but it wasn't required. And we had flipped that and said, no, you have to enter your destination up front first, mandatory. Bunch of great things came from this. You could provide the user an upfront price that was accurate. You could tell the driver where they were going, and so they could choose to accept or not accept based on how far they were going. But in regions like India and Southeast Asia, it turned out that that just wasn't the culture around ride hailing. People wanted the driver to come to them, and they would tell the driver, oh, I'm in this neighborhood 3 doors down after the church on the right, or something. It was all point of interest based. And furthermore, locations wouldn't actually snap to the Google Map, like Google Maps locations wouldn't snap to places that people recognized. Maps coverage just wasn't as good back in 2016. And so I learned a lot from this experience, but I think the number one thing I learned was how important it is to be iterative and data-driven in your development. Launch one change at a time, test it, understand it, and then move on to the next, because you can't just bundle these things in together and expect it to work seamlessly. So when you think of world-class experimentation, you probably think of companies like Meta, Google, Amazon, companies that have billions of users to experiment on and in-house super optimized platforms, plus decades of experimentation culture. But the reality is that everyone's running experiments. The problem is that only some of them have control groups and randomization. Anytime we're launching a new feature as a PM, we're experimenting. But if you're not measuring the impact of that, as Vishal mentioned earlier, you can't optimize it. So what I'm going to talk about today is essentially how we as PMs can be that voice of experimentation at a company, and how we can counter a lot of the often cited arguments that people bring up to essentially say, we don't have time or energy to invest in experimentation. So the first argument we'll cover is we're too small to experiment. The second argument I'll cover is we can't afford to slow down. We want to move fast. We need to get this revenue win out to everyone. The third is we just don't have the resources. Maybe it's time, people, energy, but we just don't have time right now to spin this up. So let's jump in. Okay, yeah, math on a screen at a conference, that's like a no-no, but we're gonna do it. So before we jump in, important concept to master, statistical power. So statistical power is essentially the probability of detecting an effect if there actually is a true effect to detect. And the reason that this thing is important is it essentially dictates how many samples you're going to need to enroll in your experiment in order to reach a conclusion that you can trust. And the number of samples that you enroll dictates how long you have to run the experiment for. Because if you're a big company, you might be able to enroll a ton of samples really quickly, but if you're a small company, it might take you significantly longer to reach that same sample size. But what's interesting is people often talk about sample size and say, oh, we're a startup, or oh, we're small, we just don't have the people to experiment on. But the reality is there's another concept at play called effect size, which is actually just as important, if not more important, than sample size. And what effect size is the number, the amount of lift you're trying to detect essentially and how big that is. If you are Google or Facebook, you're probably working on super optimized flows and you want to detect like a 0.1% lift. But if you're a startup, these are brand new flows, you're new, and also you need to see big impacts for it to impact your top line. So you might be going for a 20, 30, 40% lift. The reason this is important is that this equation that dictates power basically depends linearly on effect size, but on the square root of sample size, which means that actually sample size is much less important than effect when you're looking at whether you can experiment. Let's tactically look at this at work. So the bigger the effect that you want to detect, the fewer users you have to enroll in your experiment. So if you're a startup and you're looking for a 20% effect, you might be able to get away with relatively few users, or at least fewer than you might expect. So let's go through kind of a tactical example of this at work. Google versus Statsig. So we're gonna put ourselves on the hot seat here, but it's kind of an interesting thought exercise from a numbers perspective. Let's see. Okay, so Google, might have 100 million users going through a given flow. Statsig, we're small, we're a Series B company. We might have 10K users going through a flow that we're trying to test on. But again, we are a startup. We need to see a big effect for this experiment to actually matter. So we're targeting a 15% effect, whereas Google is targeting maybe a 0.1% effect. Who has a better chance at running a good experiment? Well, if you crunch the numbers, you'll see that actually 10,000 times fewer users at the startup only means 100x less power. But you're targeting a 150x bigger effect. And so net, that actually means we might have 50% more statistical power. So Statsig in this scenario could still run experiments and expect those to be reasonable experiments that run in a reasonable amount of time. That said, there's got to be a lower bound to this, right? You can't experiment on 50 people or 10 people. And it turns out there is. So Ronnie Kohavi is a super prolific experimentation guru. He has like a storied career. He was actually at Airbnb for a while, built out a bunch of their experimentation. Highly recommend his material. But he has talked about this concept called smart defaults, which is essentially like parameters for understanding kind of how low you can go in user numbers to still experiment. And he highlights e-commerce flows and checkout flows in particular, because those are pretty bounded, they're pretty parameterized. Most online retail sites are like a 2 to 5% conversion, and you're not gonna move that a ton. It's not gonna like double, for example. So he says, assume a 5% conversion rate on a checkout flow, and you're trying to bump that by 5%, so a relatively small effect. Realistically, you're gonna need high tens of thousands, if not low hundreds of thousands of users in this scenario. And the reason is that it's a super parameterized flow. Like it's not a super sensitive metric. You're trying to only detect a small effect. And so you're pretty constrained in what you can do there. And I think that speaks to the power of, maybe this isn't a great flow to experiment on. Maybe you should go further up funnel in your experimentation. Of course, there is the scenario for brand new startups, and actually Statsig was in this boat a couple years ago when we first started, where you have very few users and you have no chance at kind of running experiments. So what do you do in this scenario? Well, one thing that I heard a couple years ago that I really like was, beg, borrow, and steal. Take inspiration from the companies that have run experiments on similar flows. So if you're an e-commerce business and you want to build a checkout flow, you can bet that Amazon, Walmart.com, Flipkart, like all these companies have super optimized their checkout flows. And if you model yours after theirs, you're going to benefit secondhand from all the experiments they've run. So there's no shame in plagiarizing, despite what Bart Simpson is learning here. All right, second argument is about time. We can't afford to slow down ship velocity. So the first thing you can do, wow, this renders awesome on the screen. The first thing you can do is you can just try to shorten the total time of running your experiment. So two things you can do to optimize speed. One, really smartly choose which part of your product you're experimenting on. And two, really tightly constrain the OEC, or the overall evaluation criteria, and ensure that you're picking a metric that's sensitive, it has clear directionality, and it's something that like your whole team is going to be able to understand. And if you do this, what you would probably realize, harkening back to the e-commerce example I was just mentioning a minute ago, is that we were focusing down here at the bottom of the funnel and trying to optimize checkout events. What we could have done is moved further up funnel and gone to a part like product view or product details, where we were just getting more samples and we'd be able to run a tighter experiment faster. So I think just zooming out when you're setting up an experiment and being like, is this the highest leverage place to experiment, will help move faster a lot of times. The other thing you can do is actually rebrand how you frame experimentation within your org. So a lot of times people think of experimentation as quantifying upside, but it's as much about that as catching regressions and mitigating against downside. So example here. We had a beer delivery service who was a customer of ours, and they ran an interesting experiment where they wanted to optimize sign-up flow by adding kind of a Google Maps, like address autocomplete component. And they figured, okay, this is going to be great. We're going to measure sign-up flow increase. What actually happened was app session rates skyrocketed, and they couldn't figure out why. Turns out people were actually killing the app and restarting their session with this new version. And so they were like, that's interesting. They started to slice and dice the data. They realized it was disproportionately on small phone screens. And as they dug into it, they realized this new Google Address autocomplete component basically wasn't scrolling properly on small devices. And so only the first and second addresses showed up. And if your address wasn't one of those, you basically were trying to get to something that didn't exist. And so people were killing the app and restarting. And so by measuring all these ancillary kind of guardrail secondary metrics, they were able to catch a regression much, much faster than if they'd been just waiting to see an increase in signups. And so I think what's cool is that, like I mentioned, oftentimes you can get to a regression outcome much faster, because typically metric regressions happen because of a bug or bad UX, and they're usually a much larger effect. It's like it kind of goes to zero or it drops precipitously. And then, like I mentioned earlier, with this z-score equation, the bigger the effect, the fewer samples you need, and the faster you're going to see it. So there's this kind of interesting asymmetric upside-downside between trying to capture lift versus mitigating against downside. I think this is powerful because it basically reframes why experiment to be why wouldn't we experiment? Like, this just feels like a no-brainer for the health of our product and our core metrics. All right, the other thing you can do, and this is pretty nifty, is actually use some powerful statistical techniques that help you run faster experiments. So the first one's called Cupid, which stands for controlled experiments using pre-experiment data. And what Cupid does is it basically looks at any pre-exposure bias or variance in the test and control groups and helps prevent against that. So you essentially shrink your confidence intervals and run faster experiments. That's a lot of experimentation jargon, so let's go through a tactical example. Let's say we're testing universal basic income. We're going to give every American $2,000 a week and see what that does to their spending power. In this world, we divide up our American populations into two random groups, but oops, we put Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos both in the control group. If you were to run this experiment, it would look something like this. You would basically see no difference in the spending power between these two groups. Well, in reality, what's going on behind the scenes is you did have a massive impact on the spending power of the test group that you gave money to, but you can't detect that because it's so far outweighed by the spending power that existed pre-experiment of the control group. And so Cupid kind of helps reduce this variance and remove these outliers so you can get tighter, accurate results faster. The other thing you can do, and this is a fun one, how many people here have looked at an experiment before it was finished running? Just check in. Yeah, exactly. So potentially more people have checked on an experiment than have run experiments, so that's interesting. But we've all been guilty of peaking, right? And this is called the peaking problem. It's the bane of data scientists absolutely everywhere. And it basically risks that you look at an experiment early before the data has fully baked, and you're gonna actually walk away with the wrong conclusion. What's cool is there's this thing called sequential testing that basically helps prevent against this by, kind of dynamically adjusting the confidence intervals based on how far into the experiment you are. So it'll raise the bar on making a decision and seeing a statistically significant result earlier in the experiment relative to later. So this is something we use at Statsig all the time. I think our DS have publicly said they don't trust PMs, which I take personally, but it's a great thing to just always have on to ensure you're never walking away with the wrong conclusions. And then last but not least, I do want to call out top-line metrics and dashboards. So, we've all been in that situation where a VP comes to us and says, it's the end of the quarter, we have to hit this KPI, can we just rush this out the door? We don't have time to split it 50-50. If there's a big impact, won't we see it in the top line numbers? And for me, I have been through this before and have earlier in my career kind of acquiesced. A good example was Uber, it was the end of the quarter and we were trying to, I think it was 2014, we were trying to basically launch a set of new payment methods in India to optimize sign-up conversion. So we launched these, we didn't launch them as a test because we were trying to juice the numbers before the end of the quarter. And suddenly our trips charts just skyrocketed, they went up and to the right. And I was so excited, I'm a junior PM, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm awesome. And we pat ourselves on the back, go home for the weekend. We come back on Monday and our ops team in Bangalore is like, oh, that wasn't the payment method, that was Diwali, it's Diwali, and everyone's going home to family. It's a big Indian holiday, everyone's traveling, and trips would have skyrocketed no matter what we did. So I think this is a good, learning lesson in how dashboards are just inferior causality measurement tools, and ecosystem effects are complex, whether it's seasonality or it's a change that increases a metric, but then regresses another parallel metric, and so you see no top line change. There's a lot going on under the covers in top line numbers, and you can't read anything into that. All right, last but not least, resources. And as PMs, we are very well versed in the resourcing conversation. So we don't have the time, people, energy to spin up a culture of experimentation. How do you counter that? Well, one thing that at Statsig we come back to frequently is tooling. And we have this famous quote that we put on posters on our walls, we talk to customers about, it's one of our go-tos. But essentially we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. And I think this is really true because at the end of the day, if you have a good experimentation stack, it can help supercharge your practice. But if you have bad tooling, it'll get in your way, it'll drag you down, it'll give you inaccurate results, it'll confuse people, and it'll just actually add more overhead than it will help alleviate. And so what does a good experimentation tool do? Well, one, it actually scales your data science team. So a lot of times, when you say, let's run more experiments, data scientists go, immediately kind of thinking about the linear effect that will have on how much work they have to do. And a lot of that is repeat analyses. It's kind of things that you can get out of the box in a good tool. The other thing it'll do is it'll create the right hooks to kind of bring people into the experimentation process at the right times. So it'll tell you when your experiment has hit target duration so that people aren't constantly peeking trying to check whether it's done. It will help alert you if something in the setup of the experiment is incorrect and you have bias early on. So you can reset and not waste 2 weeks, right? So I think all these hooks, they seem small in reality, but they compound over time. And then last but not least, it'll actually democratize access to experimentation. So instead of 1 or 2 individuals feeling like they have to shoulder the load of building a culture of experimentation, everyone will be involved, whether it's PMs, data scientists, engineers. And I think at first this makes some data scientists feel uncomfortable, like, oh, PMs don't understand experimentation, engineers will set it up wrong. But with the right tools and the right culture, you can just truly scale that in a way that doesn't ever rely on 1 or 2 individuals shouldering the load. Many hands make light work is my framing of this. Secondarily, when resources are the issue, I think you just have to be really pragmatic in the argument you make. So as PMs, we oftentimes get dragged into, quarterly prioritization. And people are talking about, oh, I need to fund this initiative for a 5% growth win, or I want to put resources against this for a 10% revenue bump. But no one talks about the things you lose by not measuring impact. And so in our experience and kind of a bunch of industry-wide data, it converges on roughly a third of the features you ship work out of the box, right? And we're not all Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs probably had a higher hit rate than 30%. But for most of us mere mortals, 30% is kind of where it converges. So 30% has the desired impact. 30% requires iteration and maybe is like metrics neutral. And 30% of your features are actively bad and should be turned off. And so if you think about this a third, like what does that do to your top line metric? Well, if this is what you're seeing on a dashboard, what's actually going on under the covers is a bunch of metric regressions that you may not even realize are happening because you're not quantifying the impact of that feature. And so what if you didn't do that? What if you measured the impact of every feature and didn't ship the bad ones and you never shipped losers, right? That would actually fundamentally shift your top line metric in a way that, a resourcing conversation here and a new team there couldn't ever hope to do. And what's cool about experimentation is if you scale this across your whole organization, it's not limited to the one metric you experiment on. Like this will start to permeate every single metric and you'll be fundamentally shifting the curve. And then last but not least, I think it's very intimidating when you think about the amount of resources you have to put towards spinning up a culture of experimentation. That feels scary, right? Like building a new culture, teaching people, integrating a new tool, it sounds intimidating. But what we tell a lot of customers is you don't have to go straight from 0 to meta Google level experimentation. You can walk, jog, run, and then fly. And in this framework, the first steps are pretty easy. You choose your experimentation tool and then you just start measuring your launches. Just capture the bad launches. If you're thinking about a third, just stop shipping the third that's bad. And this feels much more digestible for folks, and so I've used this as a tool to kind of help people ease into experimentation. So, in summary, if you hear the argument that we're too small, we just don't have the users to experiment, counter that with the power of effect size versus sample size, which a lot of people won't have thought about deeply. And then think about your company in terms of smart defaults. How do you fit in relative to that framework? And if all else fails and you really are super, super small and just getting going, think about creative workarounds. Can you take inspiration from those companies that have already optimized these flows? Second, if you hear, hey, we can't slow down, we can't afford to spend the time, counter that with just all the ways you can set your experiments up to run in less time, whether that's choosing a more up-funnel metric or using advanced statistical techniques like Cupid or sequential testing. And then rebrand how you talk about experimentation. Start with, let's capture regressions, let's protect against downside, instead of let's try to quantify lift. And then last but not least, if it's a resourcing issue, tooling can be huge here. Think deeply about the tools you use. There's a lot of good tools on the market. Obviously, I helped build one of them, but there's a lot of options out there. And then, be pragmatic. Cite the rule of thirds. Say, hey, we're probably shipping a bunch of bad features right now. We don't even know. What if we didn't? Think about the impact that would have. And then last but not least, start small. You can walk before you run, before you fly. So that's all I've got, but I would love questions from the audience.
That was really great, Margaret Ann. Thank you. My takeaway, I have two takeaways. One is, if I want to learn how to do experimentation, I'm going to reach out to Statsig. The second one is, if I need to convince my boss that we need to do it, I'm going to reach out to you. Yes. So, questions for Margaret Ann. I saw a lot of people taking a lot of notes. This was a good session. Nobody. There we go.
I love all the examples, and they're really relevant for smaller companies. Like you said, you're trying to instill that mindset. What experience do you have with bigger companies? And in bigger companies, the challenge is usually data spaghetti, or tooling spaghetti, or guardrails and air traffic control.
Yeah, so a couple examples. I'll compare and contrast two companies. So I was at Facebook and Instagram before I was at Uber. And data culture was a little bit different between those two. They both had world-class data teams, like very well-resourced objectively. But at Facebook, I think the way they kind of emphasize their internal tooling and their data infrastructure and like the just stack on top of that was very different from Uber. At Facebook, it was a core team that built internal tools that was seen as like the creme de la creme cream of the team of the company. Everyone wanted to go there. If you were like a badass infra engineer, you went to this team, and it was celebrated. At Uber, it was kind of like, oh, your internal tools you have to deal with. It was called Morpheus, was our internal experimentation platform. And it just wasn't seen as like this prestigious, cool destination to land in the company. And I think that dictated a lot of like the output at the end of the day. Facebook had a super just like amazing internal stack, and Statsig actually is built off of Facebook. It's kind of modeled after their internal experimentation tool. And it was world class. And I think that was because they created this culture where the best people wanted to go there, and it was seen as prestigious. Uber, we definitely had a lot of data quality issues. There was some, ups and downs there. And it took a couple reboots before they finally found their groove. And so I think just setting a cultural tone of what you value as a company and how you talk about that internally matters. Like Zuck would highlight the internal infra team all the time and the tools they built and the wins they put on the board. That didn't happen as much at Uber. And towards the later years it did, and I think that helped. But the tone you set really has a compounding effect, I'd say.
We got some great, now we got technology working for us, got some great questions there. You could kind of right in front of you, pick which one you like.
Sure. When should you run
They're down here too if you want to see them. There,
okay,
it makes
cool.
it easier.
When should you not run an experiment? Okay, so yeah, there are some scenarios where you might not run an experiment, but I would argue you should still put it behind a feature flag and potentially measure impact. Example is a bug fix. So you have a pretty critical bug fix that needs to go out the door. You might want to not run this as an experiment because you know it's negatively impacting your users, but you should still put it behind a flag because you might ship this fix and inadvertently break something else. The number of times where I've been in SEVs where we quickly rush something out the door and then there's kind of a cascading negative effect downstream is very high. So I would say not necessarily an experiment, but still gate bug fixes oftentimes. Is there a minimum amount of time needed to experiment? Yes. So that was kind of the equation that I threw up on the board there, which dictates the power that you need to see to actually trust your experiment results. And that's going to dictate what's called your target duration. And so target duration basically is something you should calculate before you start the experiment. You shouldn't just start it and then see how long it goes. So you use the z-score equation to calculate target duration, you set that target duration, and then you check in when it's hit target duration. And the target duration will depend on the number of users that you enroll. How do you think about experimentation costs? Cost of running experiments? Yes, so this is real. The reality is experimentation requires actually a decent amount of advanced statistics, and those stats calculations are expensive. They're expensive from a compute perspective. You have to store all the data. You have to, just have all these kind of warehouse associated costs. And so you should budget for this stuff. Like it will be a line item. It isn't huge, but as you ramp up your experimentation practice, that can compound. Especially if you start applying things like Cupid and sequential testing, those additional analyses also cost money. That said, I think you can easily justify that with the downside cost of not experimenting and thinking about how your metrics would look if you didn't measure impact. How do you think about, that was the last one I did. Is there a minimum amount of traffic MAU-wise needed to experiment? Yes, so this is where the smart defaults thing comes in. I think you have to look at the specific flow you're trying to optimize and the effect size you're trying to drive. It's going to differ. Like I can't give you one number and just be like, if you have less than this many users, don't experiment. It's going to depend on what you're optimizing and how big of an effect you're trying to drive. I think that's it.
Great. Well, thank you. That was awesome. Appreciate
Cool,
that.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Oh, I get to take want this.
I don't know.